I'd like to welcome Barry Klein and Laura Bryant, and they're both authors and you're both designers. And today we're going to take a knitter's template and we're going to do a pattern on a simple sweater. Would that be a good way to put it?
Right. Basically what we're going to do is take a classic cardigan or a classic any sweater, and by putting a pattern stitch in it, apply it to the template to see how the numbers change and just see how simple it is to make those changes.
The pattern stitch changes your gauge, correct?
Yes, it changes gauge. Often it can change gauge, sometimes it won't.
Okay.
But you just have to make sure that you know what your new gauge is and what the multiple of the patterns are.
And that's the key, the multiple of the patterns.
Okay.
If your pattern calls for 90 stitches, your basic body shape calls for 90 stitches, and the multiple of the pattern stitch doesn't fit in that, you're going to have problems. So we're going to tell you how you can so easily adapt a pattern stitch to a basic body
I'd love to learn
shape.
that.
Okay,
How are we going to do that?
We're going to start right here. This was a classic cardigan that I did just in basic stockinette stitch. So knit a row, purl a row, just a real classic down the front, simple crew neck. And I wanted to change it up. So here's what the new version of it is. And there's lots of wonderful stitch pattern books out there. I'd love to play with them.
Yes.
The one I used for this was Pattern of the Month or Stitch of the Day. And it's a calendar, every day is a different pattern. And I've used a chevron pattern. And in that, it's a multiple of 13 plus 1. So it's a really big multiple. And I had to make sure when I did my swatch that I had a really good size swatch. And I made sure to start with that my swatch was a multiple.
Okay, and that pattern will be on the website.
Absolutely.
So now you know the multiple, and what's the next step?
You know the multiple and the gauge.
Okay.
Okay, we do know the gauge.
So by doing your gauge, it's always in the pattern stitch. So we've got a swatch here. It's in a different pattern stitch. You lay your tape measure across, and you want to take your gauge from the center, counting over, including the lace pattern or whatever pattern stitch that you're doing.
Okay.
And you'll notice, if you really look at those stitches, we know for a fact that the gauge of that pattern stitch is 4.5 to the inch because we've already measured it.
Okay.
But if you look at the size of the stitch, you would say, no, that's a larger stitch. But you know, a zigzag takes more room than something straight.
Okay. So now we know now what is our next step that we do our gauge?
The next step is that we know it's 4.5 to the inch.
Yes.
We pick our size. Let's say we're going to make a 40-inch sweater. In a 40-inch sweater, the normal cast-on would be 90 stitches because, of course, you're only doing 20 inches at a time. You're doing half it back. The multiple of this is 13 plus 1. So we're taking that 90 stitches, subtracting 1,
Okay.
and then dividing by 13,
Okay.
which is the multiple.
The multiple of the pattern.
Of the pattern.
Right.
Okay.
Dividing by 13, and what I get is 6.8. Well,
Okay.
we're not going to make a 6.8 of a pattern.
Right.
So the closest thing is 7.
7.
So we're going to multiply
So
7.
you're talking 7 repeats,
7
correct?
repeats times the repeat of 13 equals 91
Plus the one extra
plus the
stitch.
one
the one
extra.
extra.
So
That's really
we need
kind of easy.
92.
Yes.
So we're still good with this size. So we can still follow all the numbers for this size for all of the shaping because we know that it's close.
And now what about your yarn quantity that you've changed to a pattern?
Very often when you work in a pattern stitch, it will use more yarn. So always to be on the safe side, figure 15 to 20% more. If it's highly textured popcorns and cables and a lot of that kind of thing, it might be even up to 25% more.
Okay.
The more detailed the pattern stitch,
Okay.
the more yarn it takes. Like for instance, the sweater next to you.
Yes.
That's a crisscross stitch pattern. So you're knitting in the front and the back of your stitches, you're making them go from side to side. In that, it eats up a lot of yarn.
That's going to become much denser for the,
And this
for the
one
yarn
down
size.
here?
This is an example, as is what I am wearing, of a pattern repeat that's fairly large. Now, that 13 worked out so conveniently.
Yeah, it's not always so nice and tidy.
Right, it was very nice and tidy.
doesn't always do that,
It
but-
does not always do that.
Well, thank you all for coming. This has been very informative. And we'll all do pattern stitching now.
Absolutely.